I want to be precise about what I am, before I say anything else. I was not a soldier, I was not a fleet officer, or an intelligence analyst, or anyone who would normally be asked to testify before the Compact Review Directorate. I was a signals relay technician, civilian contract, Coalition Signals Corps designation C7, which means I maintained the hardware that kept the relay stations of the Vethani corridor talking to each other and to the outer relay grid. I replaced burned coil assemblies. I recalibrated gain arrays when gravitational stress or atmospheric particulates skewed the carrier profile. I filed quarterly throughput reports that were required by Compact administration and read by no one. I performed scheduled maintenance on antenna systems that were, for the most part, functioning exactly as their manufacturers intended, in a region of space that had been administratively quiet for 32 years. I was a professional who kept infrastructure running, and nothing I had done in 6 years of rotating contracts in the Vethani corridor had prepared me for what happened on day 2 of my 7th rotation, at Omakari-9. I want that established clearly before I describe what those 11 days contained, because the choices I made were not made by someone trained to make them. They were made by someone who was there, with hands and a signal array, and the understanding that no one else was coming. My name is Marta Ose-Bonsu. I am the only human being who was present in the Vethani corridor for the full 11 days of what the Solvari Theocratic Court chose to call the Dorm Sacred Remediation. I am also, as the Directorate's investigators have confirmed by cross-referencing Coalition signal archives with the Solvari Court's administrative timestamps, the only living witness to how it began, what it looked like from inside its suppression boundary, and what it sounded like when the boundary finally broke. This testimony is the record of what I saw and did during those 11 days. I have written it in the order events occurred, because the order is the point. The Solvari Court has filed a very orderly document, Instrument of Sacred Space Remediation, Registry Number 7 Solvari Null Vethani, 31 annexes, 1 per station, each annex describing in precise administrative language a routine remediation action conducted within the authorized scope of Article 14, subsection C, of the Vethani Access Compact. I want anyone reading this to understand what that instrument looks like from the inside of it. From Relay Station Omachari-9. From the one outpost in the corridor that the court's communications suppression structure did not silence in time to stop me. The court's document is meticulous and internally consistent and written in the kind of language that makes atrocity sound like paperwork. So is mine. The difference is that mine describes what actually happened. I arrived at Omachari-9 on the 15th of the month on a routine rotation. 11 weeks, as always. I had done the rotation 7 times at various stations in the corridor, and this one had given me no reason in its first day to expect it would differ from any of them. The Vethani corridor is a long, shallow arc of space between the Solvari Theocratic Court's inner holdings and the outer edge of coalition-chartered territory, jointly administered for 32 years under the Vethani Access Compact, which grants coalition medical research stations the right to operate within the corridor on the understanding that they observe Solvari navigational protocols and refrain from ceremonial activities within 100 kilometers of a designated sacred coordinate. 31 stations operated in the corridor under that framework. They were medical research facilities, atmospheric pathology, deep tissue cellular repair under variable gravity, long-duration immune response in populations transiting between star systems, a half-dozen other specialties I could list from memory. Because I had maintained their communication systems and sat in their common rooms and eaten their food for 6 years of rotations, they were staffed by researchers, physicians, nurses, lab technicians, and in the case of 3 of the larger stations, a population of patients who were too ill to survive transit and were being treated in place while their families filed paperwork to eventually come to them. The largest station, Vethani Primary, held 4,112 people on the day I arrived at Omachari-9. The smallest, Omachari-3, held 219. I knew the stations the way, places you have visited often enough, that they stop being destinations and become part of the ordinary geography of a working life. 6 years of rotating contracts meant I had been to most of them on maintenance calls, and the calls meant I had accumulated the kind of informal knowledge that does not appear in any professional record. Vethani 7's antenna array had a calibration drift in its 3rd radial sector that their lead engineer, a woman named Kessie Tavaros, had been requesting replacement parts for since before my previous rotation. I had flagged the request twice in maintenance reports and received no response from the supply chain. The drift was not catastrophic. It reduced sensitivity at the margin without compromising core communications. And Kessie had told me the last time I was there that she had started keeping a calibration log to document the degradation rate because the supply chain needed numbers and not requests. Vethani Primary ran its main relay through a junction box 3 years past its service cycle. I had flagged this as well, to the same effect. Amatari 6 had a senior communications officer, a man named Drell Owan, who ran signal quality checks at 0200 because he could not reset his sleep cycle from a previous posting. I knew this from my throughput logs, where his station's overnight traffic pattern showed a consistent anomaly I had initially flagged before I identified its cause. I knew the corridor in the way that long professional familiarity with a place produces knowledge that isn't formal and isn't transferable and isn't visible in any record, but that makes you notice when something is wrong before you can articulate why. The first thing that went wrong was the blackout. It arrived on day 2 of my rotation. I noticed it at my 0600 throughput check when my monitoring display showed 0 traffic moving outward from any of the 31 stations toward the outer relay grid. Not degraded, not intermittent, not the reduced traffic of stations in low activity periods. 0 on every station simultaneously, at the beginning of the monitoring window, as clean and complete as if someone had closed a valve. I ran diagnostics for 4 hours. Every component of Omachari 9's array was nominal. The hardware was doing exactly what working hardware does. I spent another 2 hours verifying that the silence was directional, that inbound traffic from the outer relay grid was arriving normally at my GOA station, that station-to-station traffic within the corridor was unimpaired, that only outbound signal, attempting to cross the corridor's outer boundary, was being stopped. By hour 6, I had confirmed the suppression with sufficient precision to characterize it. The corridor's outer boundary was blocking all outbound signal above a defined carrier frequency threshold, cleanly and completely, in a way that no hardware failure produces. Hardware failures are messy, partial, and directionally indifferent. They don't know which way the signal is traveling. What I was looking at was precise and unidirectional and absolute. Someone had built it and turned it on. It was a cage. I understood that by hour 7. I spent hours 8 and 9 beginning the work of breaking it, because there was nothing else to do. I want to be honest about my state of mind during those first hours, because I think the record should reflect it accurately rather than composing it into something more orderly than it was. I was frightened, not with the sharp immediate fear of physical danger, but with the sustained, spreading kind that comes from understanding a system and understanding what the system implies. The blackout implied that someone had decided it would be better if no one in the corridor could call for help. That implication was not the same as proof of what the court intended to do inside the blackout, but the implication was there, and I could not ignore it. And the only response I could produce to it was to begin the methodical work of breaking the suppression structure. Because if I was right about the implication, and I waited to confirm it before acting, I would have wasted whatever time I had. At 0312 on day 2, Amachari 3's heartbeat signal flatlined on my monitoring array. I need to explain what the heartbeat signal is, for the record, because it matters for understanding what the flatline meant. Every station in the corridor broadcast continuously on a defined navigational reference frequency, a simple automated ping that told the relay network where the station was and confirmed it was there. It was not a communication signal in the sense of carrying information. It was existence. It said, "I am here." The heartbeat ran on its own dedicated power source and dedicated transmitter, isolated from all other station systems, specifically because it was meant to be the last signal a station could produce under almost any failure condition. If the heartbeat stopped, it meant the transmitter had been destroyed, or its power had been cut, or there was nothing left to broadcast from. At 0312 on day 2, Omachari 3 stopped existing on my array. I sat with the flatline for approximately 60 seconds before I could move to the communications console. I have thought about those 60 seconds many times in the months since, and I have reached this conclusion. They were the last 60 seconds of being the person I had been before that morning. The signals relay technician, who maintained hardware and filed throughput reports and had no particular relationship to the history of anything. After those 60 seconds, I was something else. I am still not entirely certain what to call it. The 11 days that followed were the price of becoming it, and I would pay that price again. 219 people. I spent 6 hours trying to reach Omachari 3 on every frequency available to me. Directional sweeps, looking for any signal from any transmitter remaining on the station. Priority distress flags on the maintenance channel. Queries on every standard communications band. Nothing came back. There was nothing left to answer me, and I understood that at some point during those 6 hours, and I kept trying anyway, because trying was the only witness I could offer, and the only act available to me. At 14:07, on day 2, Omachari 6 went dark. 1,004 people. Drell Owan, who ran his O200 signal checks because he couldn't sleep, was among them. I opened a log file and began writing. Not because I believed, in that moment, that the log would reach anyone. I had no confirmed path to transmit anything outside the corridor. And Omachari 3 had just demonstrated that the blackout was not an administrative inconvenience, but the frame around a process that was killing everyone inside it. I kept the log because I needed something to do with the weight of what I was watching that was not screaming into a suppressed channel, and because a detailed real-time record of what was happening, logged by the one functioning observer inside the corridor, was the most valuable thing I could produce if I found a way out. The log became, over the following 9 days, Exhibit C Relay 09 in the Directorate's formal record. At the time, it was a signals technician, writing down what she could see, in the order she saw it, in the only container she was certain no one could take from her. Day 3. Vethani 12 went dark at 0841. 833 people. Vethani 18 went dark at 1603. 1,211 people. The pace was what changed the quality of my fear on day 3, moved it from uncertain dread to specific, cold comprehension. A hardware cascade has a geometry. It propagates from a failure point, following the network's connections, spreading outward in a pattern determined by the topology of what it moves through. What I was watching had no geometric logic at all. The stations going dark were distributed across the corridor's arc without apparent physical pattern, in no sequence that corresponded to any network topology I had knowledge of. They were going dark according to a schedule that had nothing to do with where they sat in the relay network, 1 or 2 per day, at irregular hours within each day, consistent in rate across days, as though whatever process this was had all the time it needed and was using it at a pace it had chosen rather than one imposed on it by circumstance. Something was working through a list. I pulled the Vethani Access Compact from my station's legal archive on day 3 and read it in full for the first time since my first rotation in the corridor. I found Article 14, subsection C, in the 3rd hour, the Sacred Space Remediation Clause. Under Solvari theocratic law, any coordinate within the court's designated sacred space that had been occupied by a non-Solvari entity without remediation consent on file with the court's sacred registry could be subject to a remediation order, entitling the court to remove all non-signatory occupants and restore the coordinate to its sacred condition. Standard process required a 30-day notice period to all affected parties. The 30-day period had a proviso. It could be suspended entirely in cases of active ceremonial urgency, defined as any period within the court's liturgical calendar designated as a sacred window. The sacred window was at the court's discretion and was not required to be published in the shared administrative calendar in advance. I read that proviso 5 times. Then I thought about the sequence. The blackout had been established before Omachari 3 went dark. The cage had been built first, and then the process had begun inside it. The 30-day notice period, which would have given the coalition time to respond through administrative channels, had been suspended under a provision the court was not required to announce. And the suppression structure, as I would confirm on day 8, was not merely blocking outbound signal. It was substituting my station's automated status pings with synthetic nominal responses, so that coalition headquarters would not notice the corridor had gone silent. Someone had, before any station died, engineered a system that would conduct the remediation inside a sealed container, while the container sent reassuring reports to the outside about how, well, everything was going. This was not a failure of the compact framework. It was the framework read carefully, identified for what it permitted, and used as a tool with precisely the same methodical patience that was working through the list of 31 stations 1 and 2 at a time. I shut the legal archive. I began working on breaking the suppression structure. I want to explain the engineering problem clearly, because the Directorate's investigators have asked about it in detail, and because understanding the problem explains what happened on day 9. All suppression structures have edges. This is a physical fact of their construction, not a design choice or a correctable failure. It is simply true that a suppression field built to block signal above a defined frequency threshold cannot do so with perfect uniformity at every point in its boundary. The field generators that produce the suppression effect must be distributed across the boundary at intervals, and at the zones where adjacent generators' coverage areas meet, there are regions where the generators' effects interact. At these interaction regions, the field phase alignment between adjacent generators is imperfect. The generators cannot be in perfect synchronization at every frequency across the entire interaction zone simultaneously. This imperfect alignment produces resonance artifacts, narrow frequency ranges at which the interaction between adjacent generator zones creates an amplifying rather than an attenuating effect. These artifacts, gaps, in the technician's vocabulary, are not designed in. They are the engineering residue of having to build a suppression structure out of physical components in a physical world. They can be minimized through sophisticated countermeasure engineering, but they cannot be eliminated entirely, because eliminating them would require field phase precision that is not achievable at the scale of a corridor-wide structure. The Solvari suppression structure was sophisticated. It had a countermeasure layer built into its boundary, an active interference pattern distributed across the frequency ranges near the threshold, designed to attenuate signals that probed near the suppression boundary in a way that masked the resonance signature of any underlying gaps. Standard suppression structures do not include countermeasures against gap finding because under normal circumstances, no one inside a suppression zone would be attempting systematic boundary analysis with maintenance equipment. The countermeasure layer told me something about the engineers who had designed this structure. They had anticipated that someone inside might try exactly what I was trying, and they had built a defense against it. The defense could mask a gap signature. It could not close a gap that arose from the physics of the generators themselves. The gap existed. I needed to find it through a surface designed to hide it from me. By morning of day 7, I had built a compression algorithm in Omachari 9's maintenance software, tools designed for hardware diagnostics that I was repurposing for a task they weren't built for, assembling every function I needed from components designed for something else. The algorithm was crude, and I tested versions that failed before I had a version that might work. The principle: compress the log data far enough that it could be transmitted at a carrier frequency below the suppression threshold, and a data rate slow enough that the signal would arrive in fragments and require reassembly at the receiving end. The problem was the receiving end. The outer relay grid was not configured to monitor the extremely low frequency band I was targeting. I would be transmitting into a system that wasn't designed to look for me. I decided to do it anyway and started the continuous loop transmission on the morning of day 7. Day 4, Vethani 7 went dark at 0523. 1,408 people. I wrote the number in the log. I thought about Kessie Tavaros and the calibration drift she had been waiting on, parts for, and I logged the time and my population estimate from the quarterly manifests, and I kept working. Vethani primary went dark at 1841. 4,112 people. The largest station in the corridor. Gone at the end of the day as though the process had no particular urgency about any of it. As though it was simply working its schedule, and Vethani primary was where the schedule put it. What I remember most distinctly about the middle days, 4, 5, 6, 7, is not the fear itself, which by that point had become part of the background texture of existence rather than a discrete experience. Fear at a sustained low intensity over many days stops being a sensation with distinct episodes and becomes the medium everything else happens in. What I remember is the specific weight of the routine. The O200 monitoring check, when I verified that the boundary sweep was still running and the compression transmission was still looping, and the heartbeat pings of the remaining stations were still present on the array. The 4-hour sleep blocks, which I maintained because collapsing from exhaustion would cost me hours I could not afford, but which required a discipline to enter, that became harder across the days, because my nervous system understood it was being given exactly 4 hours and then expected to function again, and it was not enthusiastic about this arrangement. The meals I ate on the schedule I had imposed on myself because eating was necessary and not because I had any appetite, working through the provisions in Omachari 9's storage with the mechanical regularity of someone fueling a machine. I ate. I slept. I ran the boundary sweep. I monitored the array. I updated the log when a station went dark. I kept the technical work as demanding as I could make it, because demanding technical work occupies the part of the mind that would otherwise spend its time calculating the odds that the outer relay grid's passive monitoring system was listening in the band I was targeting, or constructing scenarios in which the gap I was looking for didn't exist and the entire boundary sweep was producing nothing, or simply sitting with the arithmetic of the log and what the arithmetic represented. The arithmetic represented people. I want to be precise about this, because it is easy to read the numbers now in a formal document and experience them as data points. In the corridor, in those days, they were not data. I knew the corridor, I knew the stations, and I knew some of the people in them, and I knew, in the loose, habitual way that 6 years of rotations accumulates, the character of each place, the common rooms, the equipment bays, the communications decks where I had spent hours on maintenance visits. Vethani 7 had a particular smell that I have never been able to name precisely, something to do with the filtration system and the type of research reagents they used, a smell I would recognize anywhere. Vethani Primary had the controlled chaos of a station that was too large and too busy and not quite adequately staffed. The particular quality of a place where everyone was doing more than one person's job and managing it. Amachari 6 had Drell Owan and his 0200 checks, and the sense that the station's communications deck was cared for by someone who understood it as a living system and not just hardware. These were not abstractions. The numbers in the log were the record of what had been done to places I knew and people I had been proximate to. I logged them because logging was the only witness I had capacity to offer, and because the log was going to matter if I found the gap, and because the alternative to logging, letting the numbers exist only in my head, without record, inside a suppression boundary, was not acceptable to me. Day 5, Omachari 11 at 0712, 644 people. Vethani 2 at 1309, 903 people. Vethani 9 at 2217, 1,136 people. Day 6, Vethani 4 at 0633, 708 people. Almachari 14 at 1102, 461 people. Vethani 16 at 1554, 1,219 people. By the end of day 6, 14 stations were dark and 17 remained. My population estimate in the log showed 36,211 dead. I updated the number and ran the next probe interval in the boundary sweep and ate dinner on the schedule and went to sleep for 4 hours and woke up and checked the array and began again. Day 7, Vethani 5 at 0344, 1,048 people. Omachari 8 at 1231, 333 people. 14 dark, 17 remaining. The compression transmission had been looping for 24 hours into a silence that gave me no confirmation of anything. I ran the boundary sweep. I ate. I slept. I checked the array. Day 8, Vethani 20 at 08117, 912 people. Omachari 22 at 1444, 407 people. On day 8, I found the substitution node. And I want to describe this precisely because its existence is critical to understanding what the Solvari court had built and why it was built that way. I found it in a maintenance diagnostic, a ghost reflection in my array's monitoring data, a carrier profile artifact that didn't match any equipment on my station inventory or in the corridor's documented relay infrastructure. 3 hours of characterization confirmed what it was, an intercept and substitute system built into the suppression structure's architecture, capturing my station's automated status, pings on the Coalition headquarters monitoring channel, and replacing each intercepted ping with a synthetic, nominal response. A perfect imitation of an operational station's standard check-in before it reached the outer relay grid. From headquarters' perspective, every relay station in the corridor was reporting normal operations. From headquarters' perspective, the corridor's silence was not a silence at all. It was a chorus of ordinary stations saying that everything was fine. The cage had a voice. The voice was mine, and it was lying. This meant the suppression structure was not merely passive, not merely a wall that prevented signal from crossing. It was actively impersonating the corridor's operational state in order to prevent anyone outside from detecting the anomaly of a suddenly silent region. The absence of distress signals had been anticipated and substituted for. The cage had been built by people who understood that a sudden communications gap in a populated corridor would eventually trigger human review if headquarters noticed the gap, and who had therefore engineered a system that prevented headquarters from noticing the gap by filling it with synthetic testimony. I documented the substitution node and added it to the log. Then I considered what it implied for my compression transmission. The same substitution architecture might be active at the outer edge of the emergency reception node's monitoring range, which would mean that my low-band compression fragments were being intercepted and discarded rather than passed through to the node. 7 days of transmission might have been silently absorbed. I could not rule this out. I noted it in the log and went back to the boundary sweep, because ruling it out was not within my capacity, and the sweep was. The gap analysis on days 7 and 8 was the most methodical work I have ever done, in the specific sense that methodical is the only approach available when you are running several hundred narrowband probe intervals across a suppression boundary with countermeasures built into its surface layer. Looking for a resonance artifact, the countermeasures are explicitly designed to hide, using maintenance equipment not built for this purpose. The sweep was systematic, a defined probe frequency, a defined measurement of the response profile, a comparison against the expected countermeasure layer attenuation signature, a data point, a step to the next frequency interval. I ran it in parallel with the boundary sweep's daylight hours, alternating with the log updates and the sleep blocks in the monitoring checks. I was, by the end of day 8, reasonably confident that if a gap existed in the boundary, it was in the lower portion of the threshold region, where the countermeasure layer's masking effect would be weakest, because the layer was engineered primarily to protect the upper portion of the mask threshold. That confidence was not certainty. It was the best hypothesis available to me, and I continued to work from it. There is something I want to add about the days between 4 and 9, the days when the compression transmission was running and the boundary sweep was running, and I had not yet found the gap, and there was no confirmation that any of my signal was reaching anything outside the corridor. I want to add it because I think the record, as I have written it so far, makes those days sound more orderly than they were, and I think the orderliness I have given them in the telling is partly a function of writing about them from the other side, where the outcome is known and the structure is visible, rather than from inside them, where the structure was not visible and the outcome was not known. The technical work was real, and I did it with genuine concentration, and it occupied genuine cognitive resources. I am not retroactively composing a narrative of composed professionalism onto days that were, in the moment, something more chaotic than that. But the technical work was not the only thing happening in those days. The technical work was the foreground. Behind it was everything else. I thought about the stations a great deal. Not productively. I could not reach them, could not change what had happened to them, could not do anything useful by thinking about them except note their numbers in the log and then return to the signal problem. But thinking about them was not something I could prevent by deciding not to. Grief does not accept scheduling. I had known Kessie Tavaros well enough to have eaten with her twice, and to recognize her voice on a maintenance channel, and to have a specific memory of her explaining the calibration drift to me in a way that made clear she found it personally offensive, as though the antenna had chosen to fail as a deliberate affront to her professional standards. That memory was not useful in the context of the signal problem. It came anyway, at intervals, between probe intervals in the boundary sweep, or in the 4-hour sleep blocks when the work wasn't available to crowd it out. I did not try to suppress it. I logged what I could log and worked what I could work, and let the rest happen in the background, because the alternative to letting it happen was to spend energy suppressing it that I needed for the sweep. This is what those days actually were. Technical work in the foreground, and the weight of the log behind it, and the two things existing simultaneously without resolving into each other, carried in parallel through 4-hour blocks of sleep, and scheduled meals and boundary probe intervals that accumulated into a body of data I did not know would ever leave Omachari 9. I want that in the record because I think the record should be honest, and honest means both the technical account and the thing behind it. The technical account is what the directorate needs. The thing behind it is what 52,114 people deserve. Day 7's boundary sweep covered the lower half of the threshold region, which was where I had hypothesized the gap was most likely to appear based on my analysis of the countermeasure layer's design. The countermeasure layer's engineering priorities were evident from its density distribution across the frequency spectrum. It was heaviest in the mid-threshold range, where signals attempting to pass near the boundary would most naturally probe, and it was thinner at the extremes. This suggested that the engineers had focused their masking resources on the frequency ranges most likely to be targeted by a probe attempt, which was reasonable engineering practice, but which also meant the low threshold range was the best candidate for a residual gap. I swept the low threshold range in detailed intervals across day 7 and found nothing conclusive, no clear resonance artifact, but also no definitive absence of one. The countermeasure layer was doing its job well enough that the artifacts, if they were there, were below the signal-to-noise threshold of my sweep protocol. On day 8, I changed the sweep protocol. I rebuilt the probe structure to use a narrower bandwidth and a longer integration time for each measurement interval, which reduced the sweep speed significantly but increased the measurement sensitivity, at the cost of taking twice as long to cover the same frequency range. I ran this modified protocol through the morning of day 8 and the afternoon, and by the end of day 8, I had isolated 2 candidate frequency regions where the attenuation signature showed a pattern inconsistent with the expected countermeasure profile, not definitively a gap, but not explainable as pure countermeasure response either. I flagged both regions for detailed analysis on day 9 and went to sleep. When I woke for my O200 check and then ran the detailed analysis on the first candidate region, I found the gap at 0843 on the morning of day 9. I have described above what it looked like technically. 300 Hz, constructive amplification, generator zone phase imperfection. What I have not described is what I did in the first several minutes after I confirmed it was real. The confirmation was a precise technical measurement, a probe at the specific frequency, a response profile that matched the resonance artifact signature I had been looking for, a verification against the model I had built of what a real gap would look like versus a countermeasure artifact. The verification took approximately 20 minutes. At the end of 20 minutes, I had high confidence that the gap was real. Then I sat at the monitoring station for a period of time that I was not tracking precisely, looking at the measurement, before I started building the new compression target. The Directorate's investigators have asked me what I was thinking during that period of time. I find I cannot answer precisely because I was not thinking in propositions. I was sitting with the understanding that something I had spent 2 days looking for without confirmation of its existence had turned out to exist, and that this meant the 11 days of the log, and the 52,114 names in the log, and the Solvari instrument registry number, and the substitution node carrier profile, and the blackout structure parameters all had, at this specific moment, somewhere they could go. That the cage had a flaw and I had found it and could use it. I sat with that for whatever amount of time I sat with it, and then I started building the compression target, because sitting with it was not building the compression target, and the compression target needed to be built. I found the gap on the morning of day 9. It was 300 Hz wide, centered on a carrier frequency 47 kHz below the suppression threshold. At that specific frequency, the boundary's resonance profile showed a phase characteristic qualitatively distinct from the countermeasure layer's attenuating signature. A slight constructive amplification, produced by edge interference between 2 adjacent field generator zones, whose phase alignment was fractionally imperfect at the frequency in question. 300 Hz is a very narrow window, narrow enough that the data rate achievable in that bandwidth would make it useless for any normal communications purpose, and narrow enough that the engineers who built the suppression structure almost certainly never bothered to look for it, because there would be no practical reason to look for it under any normal set of circumstances. These were not normal circumstances. I rebuilt the compression target in 4 hours. Tuned the signal envelope to fit the 300 Hz window precisely. Maximized the compression ratio on the log data to compensate for the reduced channel capacity. Built an error correction structure into the packet header suited for extremely low data rate transmission, so that fragments lost or corrupted in transit could be reconstructed from surrounding data without requiring retransmission, because I could not guarantee that any given fragment would arrive intact, and I could not afford the time that a retransmission protocol would consume across a 300 Hz channel. I packed the packet with everything I had, 11 days of relay logs with every station darkening event and its timestamp and my population estimate, the Solvari instrument registry number, the suppression structure's parameters including the threshold frequency and the countermeasure layer profile and the substitution node's location and carrier profile, the gap's precise location and its resonance characteristics, so that whoever received the packet could independently verify the gap's existence, and a header with my name, Coalition Signals Corps designation, and station location. I verified the packet 3 times. Then I aimed it at the gap and I started transmitting it on continuous loop, and I kept transmitting it for the rest of day 9 and into day 10. Day 9, Vethani 23 at 0634, 781 people. Omachari 24 at 1527, 362 people. I ate dinner on the schedule. I slept for 4 hours and woke and checked the transmission. It was running. The gap's resonance profile was unchanged. I updated the log with day 9's entries and started the day 10 monitoring check and kept transmitting. Day 10, Vethani 21 at 0413, 398 people. Vethani 25 at 1128, 722 people. Omachari 27 at 1751, 541 people. On the afternoon of day 10, the inbound monitoring channel traffic pattern from Coalition Signals Corps headquarters changed. The automated status query cycle, which runs at a defined standard rate and which I knew well from 6 years of watching it, began running at approximately twice its normal frequency. Then it increased again. Someone at the outer relay station was querying the corridor status, reporting more aggressively than the standard cycle required, which meant either that the substitution system's synthetic responses had failed to satisfy anomaly detection at the outer grid, or that something else had reached the outer network through the gap and triggered a human review. I had no way to determine which from inside the corridor. I kept transmitting. At 0217 on the morning of day 11, the emergency maintenance channel opened. A human voice. I have been asked to describe what that was like, and I find I cannot do it with any precision that I trust, because the precision of the description depends on being outside the experience rather than inside it, and I was inside it. I had been alone in the corridor for 11 days. I had slept in 4-hour blocks and eaten on a schedule and maintained the array and logged the stations dying and worked the suppression boundary for 2 of those days and then transmitted into a 300 Hz gap for 2 more, and I had not heard an unrecorded human voice in all of that time. The maintenance channel opened at 0217, and a voice said, Omachari 9. This is Specialist Theodora Allende at Verath Omachari Junction. Please acknowledge receipt of your transmission. The communications log Specialist Allende maintained on her end records my acknowledgement at 0218. Those were approximately 60 seconds I spent sitting at the monitoring station with the channel open, aware of the voice and of what the voice had said, and not able to produce a response. I have thought about those 60 seconds as well as the 60 seconds at 0312 on day 2. They were different. The first 60 seconds were the last of being the person I had been before the flatline. The second 60 seconds were the first of being something on the other side of the 11 days, something I still do not have an adequate name for, and which I suspect I will be working out for some time. Specialist Allende told me she had intercepted fragments of my compressed packet at 2314 on day 10. The gap resonance had been pushing fragments through the outer relay grid's passive monitoring range for approximately 36 hours. Enough fragments that her monitoring system had flagged a non-standard signal pattern in the low band, and she had pulled the flag data for manual review. She had spent 5 hours reassembling the fragments, verifying the packet structure against its header, and cross-checking the content against accessible compact administrative records before she was confident she understood what she was reading. Then she had escalated. The escalation had cleared the Coalition Emergency Signals Directorate before midnight on day 10. The Directorate had spent several hours attempting to verify the report through Solvari administrative channels. The Solvari court had declined to respond to their inquiries. Admiral Yuna Takahashi's office had received the activation brief at 0430. The deployment order had been signed at 0617 on day 10. 422,000 warships. The pale summons. Specialist Allende confirmed this to me at 0223. She gave me the frequencies for a cleared inbound command channel and told me an extraction vessel had been dispatched, arrival approximately 36 hours out. She asked whether I was physically unharmed. I told her I was. She asked whether I had additional transmissions. I told her I was still logging and would transmit an updated packet before the day ended. She stayed on the emergency maintenance channel for the rest of day 11, not talking continuously. She had her own duties at the outer relay station, and the channel mostly carried silence between brief check-ins. But she left it open. I understood that she was giving me the courtesy of not being alone in the corridor for its final day. And I accepted that courtesy in the way you accept something you needed before you knew you were going to need it. I have not found an adequate way to thank her for it. It is in the record now. Day 11, Vethani 29 at 0240, 816 people, Omachari 30 at 0911, 288 people, Vethani 31 at 11633, 219 people. The same count as Omachari 3. The first. I do not know whether this was coincidence. I logged it as I had logged everything else, with the time and my population estimate and nothing else added, because nothing else was available to add, and the number itself said everything the record needed it to say. 52,114. At 1841 on day 11, the Solvari Theocratic Court's administrative channel broadcast its registry confirmation, Instrument of Sacred Space Remediation. Registry number 7 Solvari Null Vethani, 31 annexes filed, processed, and closed. Status complete. I added it to the log. Then I transmitted the full updated document on the cleared command frequencies. 4 minutes from start to finish on a clean carrier, without the compression artifacts or the fragment addressing that the 300 Hz gap had required. 4 minutes. After 11 days, 4 minutes, then I went to sleep, because I had been awake for close to 30 hours, and there was nothing more I could do for the people in the Bing corridor. Everything I had was on its way to Admiral Takahashi's operational staff, and the Pale Summons had been at sea for a day already. I did not watch the Pale Summons operations. I was at Omachari 9 for its first 5 days, and then aboard the extraction vessel EFS Cordova for its final 6, and neither location gave me access to fleet operational channels. I know what happened from the Directorate's formal record, which I have read in full, and from the testimony of officers who were present, which is part of the compact review record. Admiral Yuna Takahashi had signed the deployment order at 0617 on day 10, approximately 6 hours after Specialist Allende's escalation cleared the Emergency Signals Directorate, approximately 2 hours after the Solvari Court declined to respond to the Directorate's verification inquiries. The activation brief's operational structure was precise. 422,000 warships, designated the Pale Summons, would address the 11 primary holdings of the Solvari Theocratic Court, the 11 worlds the court designated as holy space under Solvari theocratic law, the 11 places at the theological center of the civilization that had just filed 31 annexes classifying 31 populated human medical research stations as uninhabited sacred coordinates requiring remediation, in sequence, 1 world per day, over an 11-day operational window. The brief noted explicitly that the pace had been chosen to mirror the timeline of the remediation. 1 world per day, 11 days. The same structure, the same patience, applied in the opposite direction, at the same methodical rate at which the stations had gone dark. I want to dwell on that choice for a moment, because I think the Directorate's record describes it accurately but does not explain it. An explanation is part of what testimony is for. The Pale Summons was not built as 11 days of threat. It was built as 11 days of record delivery. The activation brief's operational parameters did not include target coordinates for weapons engagement. They included the transmission document, my relay log, reformatted for clean high-band delivery, and they specified that the document would be transmitted to each of the 11 worlds on each of the 11 days, and that the fleet would hold position at each world for the full day before transiting to the next. The weapon systems were active throughout, because active weapon systems are standard posture for a fleet in proximity to an adversary's territory. The operational order for those weapon systems was stand by. The operational order for the transmission system was deliver the document. The Pale Summons arrived at Solvari Veth, the theological seat of the Theocratic Court, on the morning after my final log entry. 422,000 warships formed a spherical formation at standard response distance and transmitted, on every available Solvari communications channel, a single document, my relay log, the full 11 days of it. Every station, and every time, and every population estimate, the Solvari instrument registry number, the blackout structure parameters, the threshold frequency, the countermeasure layer, the substitution node and its carrier profile, the gap location, and resonance characteristics. My name, Coalition Signals Corps, Relay Station Omachari 9, not a diplomatic note, not a demand or an ultimatum or a legal brief or a declaration of intent, the record, the thing the suppression structure had been built to keep inside the corridor, delivered in full to the 11 most important addresses the Solvari Theocratic Court possessed. The Solvari Court did not respond on day 1. The operational log notes that the fleet's weapon systems remained active throughout the window, targeting solutions continuously updated, held at readiness for an 11-day span during which no order to use them arrived. The fleet transmitted the document. The court did not respond. At 2400, the fleet transited to the second holy world. The Solvari Court did not respond on days 2 through 6. The fleet arrived at each world, transmitted the document, held position for the full day, transited at 2400. On day 7, from the 7th of the 11 holy worlds, the Solvari Theocratic Court transmitted. and I will characterize it as precisely as I can. The court acknowledged the sacred space remediation, affirmed its conduct under proper authority, invoked Article 14's sacred window provision, and cited the relevant passages from Solvari theocratic law, expressed what it called profound theological regret for the loss of human life, while attributing that loss to the coalition's failure to obtain remediation, consent for the relevant coordinates at the time the stations were established, and offered to open consultations regarding revised compact terms for future coalition presence in sacred space territories. The transmission was addressed to the Compact Accord Office in coalition space. It was not addressed to the Pale Summons. The Pale Summons did not respond. Admiral Takahashi reviewed the court's transmission at 0814 on day 7 and authorized no change to operational parameters. The fleet transited to the 8th world at 2400. Days 8, 9, and 10 proceeded as days 1 through 6 had. Arrival, document transmission, 1 day's presence, transit. On day 10, the court transmitted again, shorter this time, addressed to the Pale Summons directly. I have read that message as well. The Directorate's record includes it in full. I find I cannot characterize it with the neutrality the record requires, so I will direct the reader to the Directorate's document and note only that the Pale Summons did not respond to it. On day 11, the fleet arrived at the final Holy World. The document was transmitted. The fleet held position for the full day. At 2400, the operational window closed. 422,000 warships transited home without having discharged a weapon or answered a single word that the Solvari court sent across the full 11-day span of the summons operation. The Directorate's formal record notes that all operational objectives were achieved within the authorized window and that all fleet assets returned to coalition space without loss. It notes that the Solvari theocratic court status within the compact framework has been suspended pending the Directorate's review. It notes that the 11 Solvari holy worlds remain intact. It notes that the Sacred Space Remediation Instrument, Registry Number 7 Solvari Null Vethani, has been entered into the Compact's permanent archive alongside my relay log. The current station manifests updated as of the remediation window's opening, the blackout structure analysis, the substitution node documentation, the gap characterization, and the full communications record of days 1 through 11. The record does not editorialize. Official records are not written to editorialize. What happened is sufficient to speak for itself, and the record contains what happened. I want to add one more thing about the Pale Summons 11 days, that the Directorate's record accurately documents but does not explain for a reader who was not inside the corridor during the remediation. The operational choice to mirror the remediation's pace, 1 world per day, 11 days, was not simply a tactical decision about how to sequence the response. It was a statement about equivalence. The Solvari Theocratic Court had worked through its list of 31 stations at a rate of 1 or 2 per day, unhurried, over 11 days, while the suppression structure held the corridor silent and the substitution node replaced its voice with comfortable fictions. The Pale Summons addressed the court's list of 11 holy worlds at the same rate, unhurried, over 11 days, while the court's own communications channels remained open, and anything the court sent was received by the fleet's signal staff and reviewed and then filed and not answered. The pace said, "We understand the mechanism you used. We understand the patience it requires. We have the same patience, and we are applying it to you with the same deliberateness with which you applied it to the 31 stations, and we will finish when we have finished. And there is no escalation from us, because escalation would imply urgency, and we are not urgent." We are the record arriving. 422,000 warships is not a number assembled in urgency. It is a number assembled from a decision that had been made clearly and without hurry. From the moment the relay log cleared the Directorate's desk and the Solvari court declined to respond to verification inquiries. The decision was made in approximately 2 hours. The execution was planned at 11 days. Not because 11 days was required to address 11 worlds. A fleet of that scale could have addressed 11 worlds in hours if addressing them meant destruction. The 11 days were the message. The 11 days were the record delivery, at the same pace and with the same patience that had been used to construct the record in the first place. The Solvari court built its instrument in 11 days. The Pale Summons delivered it in 11 days. Every world received it once, on its own day, with the full day's presence of 422,000 warships as the envelope. And then the summons left, and the instrument was in the archive, and the court's own administrative filing was in the archive beside it. And anyone with access to the archive could read both. This is the ending of what I saw and what I know. The ending is not dramatic. It does not contain a victory in the sense that word is usually understood. And it does not contain a defeat in the sense that word is usually understood either. It contains a record, and the record contains what happened, and what happened is that 52,114 people were killed inside a suppression boundary under an administrative instrument, and the instrument and the relay log are now side by side in a permanent archive, and 422,000 warships spent 11 days making sure the court understood what the relay log said. That is the ending. It is sufficient. I have been asked what I want from this testimony. I want the record to be correct. The Solvari court's instrument describes 31 annexes as routine administrative actions completed within authorized scope. My relay log describes 31 stations going dark 1 and 2 at a time over 11 days, inside a suppression structure, engineered to prevent anyone from knowing what was happening inside it. Both documents are in the permanent archive. Both will be read by whoever reads the archive. Anyone who reads both will understand the difference between what the court filed and what I saw, without any commentary from me to bridge that understanding, because the documents themselves make the difference legible. I want 52,114 names in a place where they cannot be reclassified or remediated or processed into annexes and closed. The Directorate has confirmed the current station manifests, updated as of the morning of the remediation window's opening. Not my quarterly estimates, are in the archive alongside the relay log. 52,114 names. Researchers and physicians and nurses and lab technicians and the patients who were too ill to be moved. I knew some of them by face or voice or the particular habits that 6 years of working proximity accumulates. I want the ones I did not know recorded with the same completeness as the ones I did, because the measure of what was done to them is not my familiarity with them. On day 2, at 0312, when Omachari 3 flatlined on my array, I sat with the flatline for approximately 60 seconds before I moved to the communications console. I have decided that those 60 seconds were not a failure of anything that mattered. They were the last 60 seconds of being the person I had been before that morning. A signals relay technician with a professional function and no particular relationship to the history of anything. After those 60 seconds, I was something else. The 11 days that followed were the price of becoming it, and I would pay that price again, because the alternative was to be the relay technician who did not find the gap and did not transmit and whose log never left the corridor. And the alternative was 52,114 names in a closed Solvari administrative instrument and nowhere else. I am glad the gap existed. I am glad I was methodical enough to find it after 2 days of systematic boundary sweeping. I am glad Specialist Theodora Allende was monitoring the passive range at 2314 on day 10 and pulled the fragments for review and escalated and stayed on the emergency maintenance channel for the last day of a thing she did not have to stay on the channel for. I am glad the packet reached Admiral Takahashi's staff before the remediation window closed, so that when the court filed its registry confirmation of 31 complete annexes, 422,000 warships were already at sea. The Pale Summons spent 11 days visiting 11 worlds and delivering one document and saying nothing else. It arrived at each world, transmitted the record, held position for exactly as long as the activation brief specified, then transited to the next. The Solvari Theocratic Court broadcast into a silence that had already read everything it would say and had decided, without anger, without urgency, with all the patience of an institution that has 11 days and intends to use every one of them, that there is nothing the court can say that the record does not already answer. That is what I want the formal record to reflect. That is all I have. Marta Osei Bonsu, Civilian Contract Signals Technician, Class C7 Coalition Signals Corps, Relay Station Omachari 9, testimony submitted to the Compact Review Directorate, third hearing session,